My name is Lily, and I am 34 years old. From the outside, my life seemed perfect. A cozy house in the suburbs, a stable marriage with Eric, the man I once loved passionately, and a career I had built over the years. But beneath this flawless picture lay a growing emptiness that became more overwhelming each day. Eric and I had been together for almost 10 years. In the beginning, our relationship was filled with passion and adventure. We could talk for hours, laugh, and dream together. But time had changed us. Eric, always so attentive before, became consumed by his work. His days were filled with endless calls and meetings, and his evenings were spent poring over financial reports. Our conversations dwindled to discussions about bills and groceries. Although I knew he loved me, I felt alone in our marriage. Everything changed on the day I attended a business conference in another city. It was just an ordinary work event, presentations, panel discussions, and a few dull speeches. But I had decided to go, hoping to break free from my routine. Little did I know, this conference would turn my life upside down. I had just finished giving my presentation when I saw him for the first time, Alex. He was sitting in the front row, his gaze fixed on me throughout my talk. His presence was striking, tall, with dark, thick hair, and a suit that fit him perfectly. But it was his eyes, sharp and attentive, that sent a shiver through me. As I returned to my seat, he approached me. His walk was confident but not arrogant, and his smile was so genuine that I felt my cheeks flush slightly. "You are brilliant," he said, extending his hand to me. "Your ideas on marketing strategies are exactly what we need." "Thank you," I replied, trying to sound composed but feeling slightly flustered. "It's just the result of teamwork." "Well, it seems your team is very fortunate to have a leader like you," he said, leaning in a bit closer. His words made me uneasy, but at the same time, I felt something pleasant, something I hadn't felt in a long time. That evening, conference attendees gathered in the hotel lobby for a reception. I hadn't planned to stay long, but when I saw Alex by the bar, my resolve wavered. He noticed me and raised his glass, inviting me over. "Lily, right?" he asked as I approached. "Can I buy you a drink?" I hesitated, but eventually agreed. We sat at a corner table, and the conversation flowed easily. Alex talked about himself. He was a marketing consultant, working with various companies and traveling often. "You strike me as someone who always has everything under control," he said, looking at me intently. "Control is what keeps my life together," I replied jokingly, but realizing how true it was. "But sometimes, control is a burden," he added. "Have you ever allowed yourself to just be?" His words struck a chord. They made me think about how long it had been since I felt truly alive, rather than just going through the motions. As the evening drew to a close, Alex offered to walk me to my room. I should have declined, but I didn't. The elevator was small, and the tension between us was almost tangible. He stood close, his hand accidentally brushing against mine, sending a wave of heat through me. When the elevator doors opened, he turned to me. "Lily, you know this is more than just casual conversation, don't you?" His voice was soft but full of certainty. I stood there, unsure of what to say. Then, to my own surprise, I leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, but it awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. "Good night, Alex," I whispered, pulling myself away and quickly disappearing into my room. That night, I lay awake, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. What had I done? And where would this lead? The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. What had happened the night before felt both real and unreal at the same time. The kiss with Alex had been brief, but it left a deep mark. Was it just a moment of impulse? Or the beginning of something I couldn't stop? In my head, I kept repeating to myself it was a mistake. Just forget it. But my heart told a different story. When I walked into the conference hall, Alex was already there. He was sitting at a table with a cup of coffee, looking completely at ease. Our eyes met, and I felt my heart start to race. His slight smile only heightened the tension I was trying so hard to suppress. "Good morning, Lily," he said as I walked past. His voice was warm, but there was a playful undertone that made me stop. "Good morning, Alex," I replied, trying to sound composed. I sat down at my table and attempted to focus on the materials for the presentation, but every time I glanced up, I found him looking at me. His gaze was direct but not intrusive, and I felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement building within me. After a few hours of work, we broke for lunch. Most of the attendees headed to the main dining hall, but I decided to stay behind in the lounge to avoid the crowd. Alex appeared beside me so suddenly that I hadn't even noticed him approach. "Not a fan of crowded rooms?" he asked, sitting down next to me. "Sometimes I just need some quiet to collect my thoughts," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. He handed me a cup of coffee. "Here, this helps with thinking," he said with a soft smile. I accepted it, and for a moment, our fingers brushed. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a wave of warmth through me. We sat there, talking about work, but the conversation gradually drifted into more personal topics. He asked me about my hobbies, my dreams, and even the little things that annoyed me in daily life. "You seem like someone who keeps a lot inside," he said, looking at me with that same piercing gaze that always made me uncomfortable and yet intrigued. I laughed, trying to deflect how deeply his words struck me. "Well, you don't seem like an open book either, Alex," I said, attempting to turn the tables. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Maybe not, but I'd like to open up for you." My cheeks flushed. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. They lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. That evening, the conference organizers hosted an informal reception at the hotel restaurant. I had planned to only stay for a few minutes to avoid appearing antisocial. But when I saw Alex in the room, I knew I wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. He was in a dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders, and when he noticed me, he immediately made his way over. "I'm glad you decided to come," he said, standing closer than necessary. "I just needed to unwind a bit," I replied, though deep down I knew I was there because of him. We spent the entire evening together. We laughed, we talked, and for a while I forgot about everything else. Work, home, even Eric. In that moment, there was only Alex. When we left the restaurant, the city's night lights felt magical. As we walked down the street, he suddenly stopped. "Lily, I know this isn't the right place or time, but I can't keep this to myself any longer. You're important to me." His words caught me off guard. I felt something shift inside me. "Alex, we can't," I began, but he interrupted me. "Why not? You feel this as much as I do." His words sounded like the truth I was too afraid to admit. We stood there for what felt like forever, and then he leaned in and kissed me again. This time, I didn't pull away. It was a long, passionate kiss that erased all my doubts. After that evening, everything changed. We began finding ways to be alone together. Every moment we shared was charged with tension and desire. But with it came a creeping sense of guilt. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Alex had become my secret, a part of my life that I both cherished and feared. The days that followed that night were filled with an invisible tension. Every time Alex and I crossed paths at work, I felt my heart race. His glances, the brief touches, the accidental meetings near the coffee machine, all of it created the sensation that we were walking on a knife's edge. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a harmless emotional game, a fleeting attraction that meant nothing. But the harder I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. Alex wasn't just attractive. He was attentive, charismatic, and his presence made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. One morning, I decided to come to the office earlier than usual, hoping to avoid any accidental encounters with Alex. I thought that a few hours of quiet might help me focus. But as soon as I walked in, I saw him. He was sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee, deeply focused on something on his computer. "Early today, Lily," he said, looking up as I entered. His smile was warm, but there was something more in his eyes. "I wanted to use the silence to get ahead on some work," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He stood up and walked over to my desk. "Then we're alike in that way. But maybe I can break your silence a bit, if you don't mind." His tone was light, but I felt the underlying tension. We talked for a few minutes about work, but then he leaned in slightly, and his voice softened. "Lily, have you ever thought that some moments in life are worth risking everything for, even if it feels wrong?" His words caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply shook my head, searching for a way to steer the conversation back to safer territory. That same day, during a lunch break, I decided to head to the cafeteria later than usual, hoping most people would have already returned to their desks. But when I walked in, Alex was there, sitting at a corner table. "Lily," he called out, waving me over. "Come sit with me." I couldn't refuse, and soon we were sitting across from each other. His gaze was intense, and I felt like he was looking straight through me. "You seem like someone who keeps a lot to herself," he said, his voice calm but probing. I laughed nervously, trying to hide how much his words resonated. "Well, you don't exactly seem like an open book either, Alex." He tilted his head slightly and smiled. "Maybe not, but I'd like to be more open with you." My cheeks flushed. His words were simple, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. That moment lingered with me for the rest of the day. That evening, I decided to stay late at the office to catch up on work. When I finally left the building, Alex was waiting outside. "Late night for you, Lily," he said, stepping closer. "Just trying to catch up," I replied, but his presence filled me with a nervous excitement. "Maybe a glass of wine would help you unwind," he suggested. I hesitated, but only for a moment, before agreeing. We ended up at a small, cozy bar nearby. The lighting was dim, the music soft, and the atmosphere intimate. Alex ordered 2 glasses of wine, and as we waited, his gaze never left mine. "Lily, I can't pretend this is just friendship," he said as the glasses arrived. "You mean something to me." My heart raced. I knew this was the moment I should say no, but instead, I found myself saying, "Alex, I don't even know if this is right." He reached across the table, his hand gently touching mine. "It feels right, and you know it." When we left the bar, he walked me to my car. I was about to say goodnight, but instead, I stopped and looked into his eyes. In that moment, everything else faded away. He stepped closer, and our lips met in a kiss that was full of passion and forbidden desire. I knew that kiss was crossing a line, one I couldn't uncross. We stood there for a few moments, the cold night air swirling around us. Finally, I pulled back, trying to gather my thoughts. "Good night, Alex," I said, getting into my car. "This is only the beginning, Lily," he whispered. As I drove home, I felt a battle raging inside me. One part of me begged to stop, but the other knew there was no turning back now. That evening, I stayed at the office later than usual. Work had become my refuge, a place where I could escape my conflicted thoughts. But even there, I couldn't stop thinking about Alex. His gaze, his voice, his touch, these thoughts lingered, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. Deep down, I knew this path was dangerous, but I couldn't bring myself to step off it. As the clock struck 8, I finally decided to pack up and leave. The office was silent, empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking on the tiled floor, when I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. "Working late again, Lily?" a familiar voice asked. I turned and saw Alex. He was standing a few steps away, his confident smile sending my pulse into overdrive. "Yeah, just trying to finish up some reports," I said, trying to sound casual. "You know," he said, stepping closer, "it's starting to feel like we're always the last ones here." I'm beginning to enjoy the trend. His tone was playful, but the tension between us was palpable. He walked closer, standing just a little too close for comfort, but I didn't step back. "Maybe you need a break," he said softly. "How about a drink before you head home?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. I knew I should say no. I knew where this could lead. But instead, I found myself nodding. We ended up in a small bar not far from the office. The dim lighting and soft music made it feel cozy, almost too intimate. Alex ordered a glass of wine for both of us, and as we sat at a corner table, I felt the weight of his attention on me. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," he said, leaning slightly closer. "Sometimes you just need to let go, Lily." "I don't even know how to anymore," I admitted, surprising even myself with my honesty. "Then let me help you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. His hand brushed against mine on the table, and that simple touch sent a shiver through me. We talked for what felt like hours, but it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the unspoken connection, the way his eyes locked onto mine, the way he leaned in just enough to blur the line between casual conversation and something deeper. When we left the bar, the cool night air wrapped around us, but it did nothing to cool the heat between us. He walked me to my car, and I hesitated before getting in. "Lily," he said, his voice soft but insistent, "you know this isn't just a coincidence. What's happening between us? It's real." I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling under the intensity of his gaze. "Alex, I don't know if I can do this," I whispered. He stepped closer, so close I could feel his breath on my skin. "You already are," he said, and before I could respond, his lips met mine. The kiss was electrifying, filled with passion and an undeniable connection. It wasn't a hesitant kiss like the first one. It was bold, consuming, and it left no room for doubt about where this was heading. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless. "Good night, Alex," I murmured, though my voice was unsteady. "This is only the beginning, Lily," he replied, his voice firm yet tender. Over the next few days, everything changed. We began to find moments to be alone together. A quick meeting in an empty conference room, a stolen glance across the office, lingering touches that spoke volumes. Each moment with Alex felt like stepping further into the unknown, but I couldn't stop. He had become my escape, my secret, and I was addicted. One evening, he suggested we meet somewhere more private. He booked a room in a small, discreet hotel on the edge of the city. When I arrived, my heart was racing. The room was warm and inviting, but the tension between us was almost overwhelming. As soon as I closed the door, he pulled me into his arms. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and desire. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "But I can't stop." That night was filled with passion and intimacy. His touch ignited something within me that had been dormant for years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive. But even as I surrendered to the moment, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me that this couldn't last. The next morning, I woke up before Alex. He was still asleep, his face peaceful in the dim light. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. What had I done? What was I doing? When he finally woke up, he smiled at me, his expression soft and reassuring. Lily, don't overthink this. Just let yourself feel it. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew the truth. What we were doing wasn't sustainable. We were building a house of cards, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. The evening Eric left, he left me alone in the ruins of our life. I didn't know where he had gone, or if he would return. My thoughts were chaotic as I tried to piece together how everything had unraveled so quickly. Desperate and afraid, I called Alex. "Eric knows," I said, my voice trembling. I could barely hold back the tears. "Lily, I'm here. We'll figure this out," he said with calm reassurance, but I could hear the tension in his voice. The next day, Eric returned home. He didn't shout or lash out. Instead, he was calm, too calm. He sat at the dining table and gestured for me to sit across from him. "I want the truth," he said firmly, his voice even. "No more half-truths, no excuses." My hands trembled as I folded them on the table. "It started a few months ago," I confessed quietly, unable to meet his eyes. He flinched slightly, his jaw tightening, but he didn't interrupt. "I didn't plan for it to happen," I continued, "but I felt alone. You were always busy, and I—" "Stop," Eric cut me off, his voice colder now. "You're blaming me?" "No," I said quickly, tears welling in my eyes. "I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to explain. But you didn't talk to me, did you?" he said bitterly. "You didn't even try, Lily. You just turned to someone else." His words cut deeper than any accusation I could have imagined. He was right, I hadn't tried. I'd avoided the hard conversations, convincing myself that I was the victim. A few days later, I agreed to meet Alex at a quiet cafe to discuss what we should do next. When I arrived, I was surprised to see Eric sitting at the table instead. My heart sank. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "I knew you'd be here," he said. "And I know he's coming too." "Eric, this isn't what you think," I began, but he cut me off. "It's exactly what I think, Lily," he said sharply. "And now, I want you to make a choice." I froze. "A choice?" I repeated. "Yes. Right here, right now. Choose between him and me," he demanded, his tone laced with finality. Before I could answer, Alex walked into the cafe. He stopped when he saw us, his eyes narrowing in confusion. Eric turned to look at him, then back at me. "Well," Eric pressed. My heart raced. Alex stood near the door, watching me expectantly, while Eric sat across from me, his eyes filled with pain and a flicker of hope. I stood up, my legs feeling like they would give out beneath me. "I choose." I paused, the weight of my words suffocating me. "I choose myself." Eric stared at me, his face hardening as he processed my words. "It doesn't matter anymore, Lily," he said quietly, standing up. "You've lost us both." He walked out of the cafe, and I turned to see Alex looking at me with disappointment. He shook his head, then left without saying a word. I was left standing there, alone, as the reality of my actions crashed down on me. In the following weeks, my life unraveled completely. Eric filed for divorce, and Alex disappeared from my life. I left my job and moved to a small apartment in another city, trying to escape the shadows of my mistakes. Living alone was harder than I had imagined. The silence in my apartment was deafening, and the guilt was a constant companion. But little by little, I began to rebuild. I started journaling, taking long walks, and rediscovering parts of myself that I had lost in the chaos of my life. One day, as I was sorting through my mail, I found an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short message. "Maybe one day, we'll cross paths again. Alex." I smiled faintly, but it was a bittersweet smile. The letter wasn't a promise or an apology. It was a reminder, a painful echo of the choices I had made and the price I had paid. Months turned into a year, and I slowly learned to live with myself again. I realized that my affair with Alex wasn't the cause of my unhappiness. It was a symptom of something much deeper. I had been searching for something outside myself to fill the void inside me. And now I understood that the only way to truly heal was to face myself, flaws and all. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was my new beginning. A chance to rebuild, to rediscover, and to finally take responsibility for my life.
Please subscribe to our channel Stellar Stories. We have new amazing stories coming out every day. Thank you.